Cuba's idyllic image hides a dark secret. Fidel Castro created a system of hidden prisons where dissenters disappeared without a trace, and forced labor, torture, and indoctrination were routine. For decades, the truth was buried. But now, survivors are speaking, and the story of Cuba's secret prisons is finally coming to light. In the aftermath of the Cuban Revolution, Fidel Castro rose to power with a promise to transform his country. But beneath the image of a revolutionary leader, a darker agenda was quietly unfolding. To maintain absolute control, Castro established a system designed to eliminate dissent and consolidate power, ensuring that anyone who opposed the regime would face unimaginable consequences. Political prisons became the backbone of this system. Castro's regime created hidden detention centers where individuals accused of opposing the revolution, practicing religion, or simply being labeled counter-revolutionary were sent. These were not ordinary prisons. They were secret facilities, deliberately isolated to conceal the scale of human rights abuses from the world. The UMAP forced labor camps, established in the 1960s, were among the first of these hidden institutions. Designed for political dissidents, religious practitioners, LGBTQ+ individuals, and conscientious objectors, these camps turned citizens into tools of production under brutal conditions. Prisoners endured harsh labor, inadequate food, and relentless psychological torment, all while being cut off from any outside contact. At the same time, Castro's regime monitored every corner of Cuban society, ensuring that fear and surveillance kept citizens compliant. Families lived in constant dread, knowing that even a hint of disobedience could result in the disappearance of a loved one. For decades, the true extent of these secret prisons remained hidden. The world only began to uncover the full scope of Castro's system of repression through de facto testimonies, historical investigations, and reports by human rights organizations. But the deeper the investigation went, the more disturbing the reality became, revealing not just suffering, but a systematic and calculated campaign to erase opposition entirely. By 1965, Fidel Castro's government had established the UMAP camps, Unidades Militares de Ayuda a la Producción, as part of a secret program to imprison those deemed counter-revolutionary. These camps were intended to re-educate political dissidents, religious practitioners, LGBTQ+ individuals, and conscientious objectors through grueling forced labor. But in reality, they became a nightmare of human suffering. Prisoners were sent to remote areas of Cuba, often under harsh conditions with minimal food, exposure to the elements, and long hours of labor. Inmates were forced to work in agriculture, clearing fields or harvesting sugarcane while being closely monitored by armed guards. Physical abuse and psychological torment were commonplace. Failure to comply or show correct revolutionary spirit often resulted in beatings or solitary confinement. The UMAP camps were designed not only to punish, but to break the spirit of those incarcerated. Many prisoners experienced permanent injuries, malnutrition, or long-term psychological trauma. Defector accounts describe the daily struggle to survive, highlighting how fear, isolation, and relentless labor became tools of control. Some detainees were institutionalized after being pushed to the brink of physical or mental collapse. Despite the horrors, these camps remained largely hidden from the global community. Families were rarely informed of the whereabouts of their loved ones, and the regime kept the true conditions secret from even most Cuban citizens. The world would only learn about the scale of the abuse decades later through survivor testimonies and human rights investigations. And yet, UMAP was only the beginning. It paved the way for a network of secret prisons and an entire system of political repression that would persist for decades under Castro's rule.
Within the hidden world of Fidel Castro's secret prisons, a group of political prisoners emerged as a symbol of resistance and defiance. the Plantados. This term referred to inmates who refused to bend to the regime's demands, maintaining their principles despite facing extreme punishment. Unlike those who tried to survive through compliance, the Plantados chose resistance over submission, even when it meant enduring unimaginable suffering. Prisoners in this group were subjected to prolonged solitary confinement, physical abuse, and relentless psychological pressure. Their crime was often nothing more than refusing to participate in forced labor indoctrination programs, praying in secret, or maintaining their identity outside the state's control. Castro's regime saw these individuals as a threat to its authority, and the Plantados were treated with extraordinary cruelty to serve as an example to others. One of the most vivid accounts comes from Armando Valladares, a former Plantado who endured years of imprisonment for his defiance. Valladares described overcrowded cells, starvation, and beatings that left many prisoners permanently disabled. Yet, despite the daily horrors, the Plantados continued to resist, using small acts of rebellion, secret messages, refusal to work, and clandestine worship to assert their humanity. The courage of the Plantados revealed the true cost of standing up against totalitarian control. While many suffered permanent physical and psychological damage, their defiance inspired later generations of Cuban dissidents and provided critical testimony about the cruelty of Castro's prison system. But the Plantados were just one part of a larger, far darker network of prisons, a system where the regime's control extended into every aspect of life, and where countless others endured suffering that few outside Cuba would ever imagine. While UMAP camps and Plantados highlight the forced labor and resistance, Presidio Modelo stands as a stark symbol of Cuba's institutionalized oppression. Originally built during the 1920s, this prison on the Isla de la Juventud became infamous for its overcrowding, harsh conditions, and brutal enforcement of discipline. Although initially housing criminals, after the revolution, it transformed into a political prison under Castro, containing thousands accused of opposing the regime. Inside Presidio Modelo, prisoners endured inhumane treatment, including forced labor, malnutrition, and lack of medical care. The architecture itself, a circular panopticon design, was meant to ensure constant surveillance, symbolizing how prisoners were always watched, stripped of privacy, and forced into psychological submission. Guards wielded absolute power, enforcing harsh punishment for even minor infractions. Other prisons across Cuba mirrored this system. Secret detention centers and high-security facilities operated in isolation, far from the eyes of the public and the international community. Detainees were subjected to torture, beatings, and prolonged isolation, often with little hope of release. Political prisoners were sometimes held for decades, and family members were kept in the dark about their fate, intensifying the climate of fear and uncertainty. Yet, despite the overwhelming control, prisoners found ways to resist. Many engaged in silent acts of defiance, including secret communication, maintaining cultural or religious practices, and documenting abuses when possible. These acts, though small, provided critical evidence for human rights organizations once the survivors shared their stories. The horrors of Presidio Modelo and other prisons reveal a systematic approach to suppress dissent. But as survivors' testimony emerged, the world slowly began to see the true scope of Castro's secret prison network, a shadow of suffering that would haunt Cuba for generations. Inside Fidel Castro's secret prisons, the brutality went far beyond forced labor. Prisoners endured systematic torture designed to crush their bodies and minds, leaving lasting scars that persisted long after their release. The regime employed physical abuse, including beatings, confinement in extremely small cells, and exposure to harsh environmental conditions. These methods were intended not only to punish, but to erase any sense of identity and will.
Psychological abuse was equally pervasive. Prisoners were subjected to prolonged isolation, denied contact with family, and forced to witness or endure the suffering of others. This constant environment of fear and uncertainty created a climate of terror that broke down individuals' ability to resist. Many prisoners suffered mental collapse, with some exhibiting symptoms of post-traumatic stress, depression, and permanent psychological damage. The regime also used public humiliation and coercion as a method of control. Prisoners were forced to perform grueling labor under the watchful eyes of guards, often while being ridiculed or threatened with execution. Those who resisted were subjected to even harsher punishments, including solitary confinement for months or years, which sometimes led to permanent physical and mental deterioration. Religious and political dissenters faced extra layers of punishment. They were tortured for refusing to renounce their beliefs or cooperate with the regime's indoctrination programs. LGBTQ+ prisoners were targeted specifically for humiliation and abuse. Reinforcing a system of discrimination and fear, the goal of Castro's secret prisons was total control through terror. Every act of abuse, every psychological trick was designed to maintain power, suppress opposition, and ensure obedience. But even in the darkest moments, prisoners found ways to resist silently, leaving behind testimonies that would later expose the true human cost of these secret prisons to the world. Fidel Castro's secret prisons were designed to target those considered enemies of the revolution. Religious practitioners, political opponents, LGBTQ+ individuals, and anyone expressing dissenting views were vulnerable to arrest, imprisonment, and abuse. These groups faced disproportionate repression as the regime sought to eliminate any threat to its absolute control. Religious leaders, particularly priests and pastors, were imprisoned for practicing faith outside state-sanctioned norms. They endured forced labor, isolation, and indoctrination, often being compelled to renounce their beliefs or face severe punishment. Families of these prisoners were frequently intimidated or harassed, reinforcing a climate of fear that extended beyond the prison walls. Political dissidents, including former allies of the revolution who opposed Castro's policies, were also singled out. They were sent to camps like UMAP, or high-security prisons such as Presidio Modelo, where their daily existence was a test of endurance under cruel labor, starvation, and psychological torment. Even minor expressions of criticism could result in long-term imprisonment. LGBTQ+ individuals faced additional layers of persecution. In the UMAP camps, they were often publicly humiliated, physically abused, and socially ostracized, treated as deviants rather than citizens with rights. This systematic targeting highlighted how the regime used the prison system to enforce ideological conformity and suppress any challenge to its social order. Through these secret prisons, Castro's regime maintained control not just through fear, but through erasure of identity and systematic repression. The prison network became a tool of ideological enforcement, ensuring that opposition was silenced, marginalized, or broken entirely. Yet, despite the oppressive system, some prisoners resisted, and their stories would later expose the true human cost of these secret prisons to the world. Despite the relentless oppression within Fidel Castro's secret prisons, some prisoners managed to survive and even escape to share their stories with the world. These testimonies provide a rare window into the brutality, endurance, and resilience of those who endured Cuba's darkest detention facilities. One of the most well-known survivors, Armando Valladares, spent years as a political prisoner in Cuba. Valladares described the harsh realities of forced labor, including back-breaking work in fields and construction, minimal food rations, and constant surveillance. Solitary confinement was also commonplace, with many prisoners spending years in isolation. Confinement, beatings, and torture were daily occurrences for those who resisted indoctrination. Yet Valladares's resilience and determination to survive allowed him to later document the horrors of the Plantados, prisoners who refused to compromise their principles under extreme duress. Other survivors, including those from the UMAP camps, recount being isolated from the world and subjected to conditions that stripped away identity and dignity. Despite the physical and psychological torment, many found small ways to resist, whether through clandestine communication, secretly maintaining religious practices, or helping fellow prisoners endure the harsh environment. Escapes were rare, but when they occurred, they were acts of incredible courage. Survivors risked recapture, punishment, or death to flee the oppressive conditions, often relying on smuggled documents, covert networks, and sheer determination. These escapees became vital witnesses, providing first-hand accounts that would later inform human rights organizations and bring international attention to Cuba's secret prison system. The survivors' stories reveal the human cost of Castro's system, the lives broken, families torn apart, and identities stripped away. Yet they also reveal the resilience of the human spirit, proving that even in the darkest conditions, people can endure and testify to the truth. But even as survivors share their experiences, the shadow of these secret prisons continues to loom over Cuba, leaving questions about justice, accountability, and reform unanswered. For decades, much of the world remained unaware of the full scope of Fidel Castro's secret prisons. Cuba's tight control over information and strict censorship made it extremely difficult for news of human rights abuses to reach the global community. The regime used propaganda to maintain a revolutionary image, masking the suffering endured by thousands of political prisoners, religious practitioners, and LGBTQ+ individuals. Human rights organizations gradually began to uncover the truth. Groups such as Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and other NGOs documented abuses through defector testimonies, leaked government documents, and satellite observations. Reports described forced labor, torture, psychological abuse, and family persecution, exposing a systematic pattern of human rights violations that extended across decades. Despite these revelations, international action was often slow and limited. Geopolitical considerations, including the Cold War context and Cuba's alliances with other nations, constrained the ability of governments to impose meaningful pressure on the regime. Sanctions and public condemnations were issued, but the prison system persisted, leaving the victims with little recourse. The lack of global intervention had profound consequences. Secret prisons continued to operate, and new generations of Cubans were subjected to repression, indoctrination, and forced labor. Families remained separated, and dissenters were silenced. The international community's inaction allowed Castro's regime to maintain control without facing significant accountability. Yet the tireless work of survivors and human rights advocates slowly brought these hidden abuses to light, forcing the world to confront a reality far harsher than the propaganda suggested. Even today, questions remain. How much more could have been done to stop the suffering? And will the world finally ensure that Cuba's secret prisons are exposed and their victims remembered?